Okay, and thank you for joining us today for honoring Harvard's charter, Beyond Land Acknowledgments to Action. Uh, my name is Emily Van Dyke. I'm Siksika, and I'm honored to join you today. I serve as Native American alumni of Harvard University president and have for the last 5 years. I've also been on our board for all 14 years of our existence, and we've hit some great milestones, and one of those is that this year we're honored to get to support all three of Harvard Forward's candidates for 2021, which is new territory for us. We've usually gone with a sort of prearranged slate, but we were really excited about Megan's candidacy and her two colleagues. So we're excited to bring you this webinar along with Harvard Forward today. Um, I'm honored to share this virtual space with you from the unceded land of the Duwamish people of Seattle, past, present, and emerging, honoring with gratitude and admiration the resilience of the land itself and of the Duwamish tribe, which continues on a 4 decades long journey to gain federal recognition here in Seattle. And because our shared bonds to Harvard bring us together today, we honor the original stewards of the land on which Harvard sits. Harvard University is situated on the traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. The Harvard Charter of 1650 committed our institution to the education of English and Indian youth of this country. As a chartered creation of the Massachusetts colonies and the Commonwealth, Harvard evolved alongside the original stewards of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts, the Oquinawampanoag, Mashpee Wampanoag, and Nipmuc Nation, who are still living, working, and building community on small portions of their traditional homelands. Our acknowledgement serves as a first step away from the erasure of these profound histories of survival, perseverance, and innovation. We are all connected and our lives are interdependent. Like the climate crisis, COVID has reminded us powerfully that each of us only thrives if we are attentive and proactive about protecting our communities and the environments in which all life depends. So several of you have already done this, but Danielle's going to share a nativeland.ca link that will help you look up the original inhabitants of the lands on which you may be sitting right now. So if you wish to, and you haven't done so already, please feel free to share in the chat your own brief land acknowledgement. So before we get started, I'm just going to share some brief housekeeping details. If you need tech support or have a question, please chat Danielle Strasburger. And if you have questions for our presenters during the program, please put them in the chat. You can do so at any time, and then we'll call on you as time allows at the Q&A portion at the end of the program. So in the meantime, please remain on mute just so that we don't get confused and get interrupted. And also this event will be recorded, is being recorded. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelsey Leonard, a citizen of the Shinnecock Indian Nation, who's an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, where her research focuses on Indigenous water justice and its climatic, territorial, and governance underpinnings. She earned her master's in water science policy and management from Oxford, and she was once a member of Native Americans at Harvard College as a student. She's a former president and current board member of NAHU. And we, the alumni, chose her as Harvard Alumni Association elected director last year in 2020, which is a role she'll continue to hold until 2023, excuse me. So with that, over to you, Kelsey.
Tabutni, thank you, Emily. I'm glad to be joining everyone. We have a few slides just because if you're visual like me, it's always great to have that representation as we go into conversation this evening. So as Emily mentioned, I am from the Shinnecock Nation. So we are a coastal Algonquin tribal nation located on the east end of what is currently known as Long Island, New York. And so I speak today not so much from my position as a scientist and a researcher, but as an alumna of Harvard College, class of 2010, and now being heavily involved as an elected director for the HAA, but then also through maybe my other roles, as Emily mentioned, in being involved with our Native alumni more broadly. And I think it's now more than ever important with the contemporary calls for social justice for the university and for us as alumni to examine what our response will be, to be a part of realizing social justice across multiple spaces through which the university has power and influence. A part of that, we know that for there to be climate justice, which is a large part of the Harvard Forward platform, there also needs to be social justice. They are intertwined and woven together. And I think as alumni, a space through which we can ground ourselves and try and answer the question, what can I do? What can I do for my little square of being a Harvard person in the world? And I think to answer that question, we can go back to the formation of Harvard College and at the university more broadly. We are, and I would go so far as to say probably the only university in the world. And if we're not, let me know, because I think it would be great to have a few more in the club. But the only university in the world whose charter specifically mentions for the education of Indigenous youth. And that has to mean something, even in 2021. And I think when we think about the legacy of the university and how it has lived up to its charter, it has largely failed in its capacity to meet its charge for the education of Indigenous youth over time and history, and even today. We have made great strides. There are aspects of the university that have improved in recent decades, but there's still so much more that we can do. I often ask myself, and there's a great piece by Susan Powers and another Harvard alumna and Indigenous writer who talks about her experience as a freshman living in Harvard Yard and the deep connection that she felt to those first Indian college students, like Caleb Chishitama pictured here, who's the first graduate of Harvard College. And I often ask myself the same questions that she puts forward in that article, which really is to ask ourselves, how would Caleb feel? What would these first Indian college students have felt seeing us now today? How would they respond to Harvard's original covenant and promise to its Indigenous nations? And I wonder, I don't necessarily know that they would be as thrilled or enthralled with what they see. And so I think that's a bit of our call and our charge as alumni. If we look to this map of the Indigenous nations just within the region of Harvard University, when we look to sort of the lands and territories that Harvard occupies, what is our level of relationality and reciprocity that Harvard is giving back to these communities through, upon which we've taken so much, and the university itself has taken so much, whether that be through land or economic resources, or the indentured servitude and labor of Black and Brown bodies. There's a lot of historical legacy that needs to be reconciled on the part of the university. And I think our role as alumni, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, is to come together in a form of allyship where we can move beyond, as you see in the title of today's conversation, move beyond land acknowledgement. That's important in one aspect, to ground us and to center the conversation so we understand who is coming into conversation with one another and whose voices are being heard or not being heard. But at a certain point, we have to get past acknowledging and get to the actual work, to the action. And our charge is still based on that original charter. It is still based on, not only do we need to acknowledge the nations and the communities upon which Harvard has been built, but how can Harvard sustain that original covenant, sustain that original relationship, and ensure that the actual charge laid out of the education of the Indigenous and Indian youth is fulfilled. And so as alumni, we all have a role in that. And so I will turn it over for the next portion of our conversation to Emily, our wonderful NAHU president, to talk a little bit about the way in which we are called to action as Native alumni and through the work that we do with NAHU.
Great, thank you so much. So I wanted to, I'm going to give a little bit of a background about NAHU and keep it pretty brief, but please feel free to ask questions later if I skate over anything. So I started the timeline with 1665, which Kelsey just covered. We had two really strong Wampanoag Native students, one of whom was going to be the valedictorian, but unfortunately was killed right before commencement. And Caleb Chisatiamak, whose beautiful picture is in the Annenberg Dining Hall, is basically the only not white male, as far as I know. But so all these years later, in 2007, we founded Native American Alumni of Harvard University. We were only the second group of our type, sort of organized by heritage, by affinity group, as Harvard calls it. And when Erica Scott asked if I would join the board in February 2007, I said, yes, this is urgently needed. As Kelsey has alluded to, there's a lot of work still to do. And each student in turn has found that Harvard campus isn't as welcoming as it might be. Not I think due to any intent, but due to a lack of representation in leadership positions that causes some blindnesses and causes some lack of appropriate treatment of Indigenous histories and students. So as I remind myself how to use Prezi in the first place. So just quickly, our first symposium was 6 years later, and we talked about basically research in Indian country. We generally meet at the same time as the Harvard University Powwow and the Arts First Festival. When we can, we work with the students, with the NAC students, to present art or just do our own art installation, to just make sure that people know we're on campus, that there are Indigenous people on campus, that the alumni are engaged, and that we're keeping an eye out on the students, and we want to see improvements. So our most recent symposium looked at advocacy for the rights of Native Americans and Indian tribes in the Trump era. It was a really robust look at changes that at some of the really fascinating cases that the Supreme Court had recently heard and decided upon within that last year. I sure learned a lot. And again, we held our 2019 symposium in conjunction with Arts First Weekend and with the 21st annual Harvard Powwow. And I just wanted to flag, since Megan's an esteemed, fierce former leader, that we honored fierce leaders of that era, Sarah Wright and Heather Watts, who were really impressive alumni. And so this has been a really busy, really dynamic, exciting time for NAHU. I quite frankly struggled with my slides, just sort of trying to keep them somewhat limited in the text heavy side of things. So we had hoped to do another spring symposium on campus as usual. HUNAP had hoped to do a really impressive cavalcade of events on campus to celebrate their 50th anniversary. Instead, both organizations pivoted to a lot of online programming, which ended up serving us really well because it decreases the participation barrier and gets people really talking. So NAHU has been holding quarterly town halls We held an election in 2020 and used one of the town halls to help people meet the people running for election. We launched a mentorship program that has been a long-term goal of mine as president. So it felt so good to finally launch that, especially in the era of remote learning when we all know that the students really could use some support and some more advising when they can't just drop in and access that advising. We had an incredibly exciting, robust allyship webinar with leaders from literally around the globe, excitedly volunteering to co-sponsor and spread the message that we were talking about this amazing story where the Choctaw Nation, having just, the survivors who had just been forcibly removed, gathered together what would in today's terms be $5,000 and sent that to people facing the Irish famine on the west coast of Ireland, which is a donation that's still honored both in verbal histories and in a beautiful sculpture. So we talked about that gift and how that gift then inspired over $1 million in really quite small donations per donation, but a huge impact overall in 2020 in donations to the Navajo and Hopi COVID relief project that was started by another really impressive Harvard native alum named Ethel Branch. So we had a great webinar with that. And then we're continually doing Unity webinars, and I'll talk a little bit more about Unity in a moment. But I would strongly advocate for looking up Unity webinars and joining us again on Thursday if you have the time. And we're also currently rolling out a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Two-Spirited People virtual installation with the Fashion, Luxury, and Retail SIG to raise awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is a really important movement that I hope you'll ask me about if you want to learn more. So I mentioned the Unity webinar that's coming up on Thursday. We've been partnering with HBAS, H4A, HLAA, and NAHU has been partnering with those SIGs for 2+ years now to put on a conference that is now at the end of September 2021, having been postponed from 2020. And so all alumni are welcome. It's going to be free and online, and the program I think will be excellent. So please register when you can. And we are hoping that we can return to some semblance of normal in spring 2022 and meet again on campus and join the powwow. So we shall see. All of us will see what we can safely do. But in the meantime, we are continuing to push for some much needed, long overdue change at Harvard, including celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day exclusively, curricular and ad board changes so that our students aren't sent home far more often than the average. Our numbers say 4 times the average of non-Indigenous, non-Hispanic whites. So that is a concerning rate to us. And we're trying to do our very small part in our mentorship program, but what's really needed is on-site funded undergraduate and graduate advising with active outreach from the first fall quarter so that people know that they have support. So that's really just the beginning of what I'm asking for, but it's a good start. It's now my pleasure to introduce Megan Redshirt Shaw, who's an Oglala Lakota educator, writer, higher ed expert, and a Harvard Forward candidate, as you probably know by now. Megan received her master's degree from HGSE in 2017 and was selected as convocation student speaker. She also co-chaired FIERCE in her time, which I mentioned, I think, just as an acronym, but it's Future Indigenous Educators Resisting Colonial Education. She is also a PhD candidate currently, and sorry, I'm blanking on the official title, Megan, so I'm going to hand it over to you so I don't get it wrong.
That's okay. Thank you, Dr. Van Dyke. I appreciate that. I'm going to introduce myself in Lakota first. Michajiki Megan Redshirт Shao, Ko Michajiki Chanko Ashnawi, Wazia Hanaha Hemataha Malakota. And just want to say thank you so much to everybody for joining us this evening. I'm really, really honored to be on this panel with Dr. Van Dyke and Dr. Leonard, who have done a tremendous amount for Native communities and Native people. And I think it's important for me to share that the other evening when the four of us met with Danielle, we had a very long conversation about all of the things that we could talk about this evening with all of you. We have a short amount of time. These are some of the action items that we're really hoping to share with you and to be reflective of. And really, I'm here to sort of provide an opportunity for looking forward and how we push these things forward for Native students who are currently on campus, but also for the generations of Native students who are coming after us. Those of us who are alumni are able to look back on our experiences, much like Dr. Leonard and Dr. Van Dyke reflected on, and say that there were the best of times and the worst of times. I think that Harvard in so many ways has forgotten the original charter. And so often I think as institutions, we are I work in higher education. I'm the director of Native Student Services at the University of South Dakota. And I think often when we are in situations within higher education frameworks, we think that providing a land acknowledgement is enough, right? It's enough just to say a land acknowledgement at the beginning of an event, and we've checked the box and we've represented Native people, and that's it. We can move forward. Harvard in so many ways has already done so much to support Native students. And so before I sort of do the projecting forward, I think it's important for me to also be reflective of the things that are beautiful and important and amazing about our communities. For me, it's very important for me to acknowledge that I was a graduate assistant at the Harvard University Native American Program, which is a designated office on campus, very similar to the role that I currently serve as a director of Native Student Services and being in community at the cultural center, at the community center. It's really important for me to acknowledge Shelley Lowe, Jason Pacno, and Sam Hernandez, who were all there during my time in the 2016 and 2017 school year. And at the time, the faculty chair was Dennis Norman. Those four had a tremendous amount of impact on my feelings of self-worth on Harvard's campus. And so it's really important for me to acknowledge them before I sort of talk about this idea of moving forward and how do we push these initiatives forward. Those four, as well as predecessors who were in those roles, have done a tremendous amount to push the institution to think about things differently. I think one of the greatest challenges within Harvard is sort of the phrase many of you might be familiar with, this idea of every tub on its own bottom, I think was often used when describing Harvard, the graduate programs, the college. And so being able to actually unite as a front to focus on Native issues or indigeneity or approving Indigenous Peoples Day across all of the schools, those types of conversations, unfortunately at Harvard, I think for those who have done this work have been tremendously hard. And so some of the things, and there's incredible Native faculty on the campus now, incredible allies who are doing work focused on Indigenous people. I was very lucky as a student to be able to take classes in nation building with Joe Colt and Dennis Norman. So there's a tremendous amount that's happening and conversations that are happening and students that are really pushing this work forward. It's continued today with tremendous faculty who are doing that work as well. But it's really important for us to acknowledge that this year, at this time, COVID-19 has changed us forever, and Native communities are changed forever. And so the way that we think about inclusive governments, contemporary issues, it's different, and we have to be willing to change. And Harvard too, over its history, has had to be willing to change as well. And so some of the things that I think are very important that very much align with Harvard Forward's mission and the things that we're hoping for around inclusive governance. Climate change and environmental justice is a tremendously huge issue. In case you need the reminder, Native people are the original environmental and climate focused stewards. We're the people that knew tremendous amount about caring for our environments. And that very much aligns with what Harvard has decided to invest in, what it's responsible for investing in. So how do we really push Harvard to have conversations? If they have used Native people within their charters, are they really actually having Native people at the table when they're talking about things like environmental justice or climate impact? We also have to have conversations around sovereignty-focused justice. I know something that we talked about in our visit prior to this call was really this idea of respecting local communities. Dr. Van Dyke read a land acknowledgement earlier and acknowledged the communities that are around Harvard's campus, but are we really in partnership with them? Are we actually in conversation with them? And how do we push Harvard forward to have those conversations with people who are actually experts in the territory and in the region and would be able to actually advise Harvard on what to invest in, who to be in partnership with, who to be in conversation with? Those things are tremendously important. And really this idea of aligning our investments with our values. Who does Harvard really want to be at the end of the day? Is it investing in companies that are building pipelines through sovereign nations? Is it pipelines that have destroyed homes of Native students that can't consider Harvard because they don't have any concept of that possibility for themselves in their lives? What do these issues really look like in Native communities? And, you know, are we supporting industry that really is working with Native people in mind, with all of these different communities in mind? So I think that also this idea of inclusive governance, giving voices space that haven't been given, putting more Indigenous people at the table, these are some of the things that I'm really hopeful for as we sort of look forward and push forward many of the things that the three of us are in conversation about this evening and hope to be in conversation about with all of you. And so I don't want to take up too much time because I also want us to be in conversation. I think the three of us probably could have talked for 4 hours the other night because there's so much to cover. But even just these ideas of looking forward, like how do we put more Native people at the table and remind ourselves that more Native students are going to come to Harvard, whether Harvard wants to acknowledge it or not, or be willing to do the work, and what are our responsibilities as alumni and as people who have voices and have had those experiences to really push those ideas forward. So those are some of the things in terms of looking forward and really looking at everything that's been accomplished that I think are really important for us to focus on this evening. And I'll turn it back over just to see how we kind of move into a casual conversation and have some audience engagement as well.
So Danielle, do we have some audience questions, or should I ask one?
I think we've got one framing question for ourselves. Grab it for folks. So I'll pose this to my co-panelists, Megan and Emily. How did your experiences as Native students at Harvard launch you into your advocacy as an alum?
Yes. So when I was a freshman, I wasn't aware of NAC being in existence. I don't know absolutely for certain that it wasn't, but I did attend the HUNAP welcome with a Chumaran friend of mine who was more linked into her community than I was at that time. And I really needed there to be an ACK. So when some amazing student leaders showed up while I was a senior and they were undergrads just showing me the way, Erica Scott and Dwayne Clarence Meat and Elijah Hutchinson, we formed an executive committee and said, we've heard about this thing that was NAC and we think it needs to happen. And the four of us in a dining hall are going to make this student organization re-exist. And man, did I need it, because you just sort of get through your day, but after 4 years, the toxicity of being the only person who ever recognizes your history and your current reality, your lived reality, what people you love are going through. When you, I mean, I loved being at Harvard and I was honored to be at Harvard, but it's exhausting to try to explain some tiny part of your real reality. So having NAC come together was sort of life-changing as a senior. Like, I don't have to explain absolutely everything anytime I try to have a conversation. So that made me feel like NAC and NAHU just plain had to persist. I didn't want any undergrads to not have anybody at all who got them. Not that I didn't love all the other students I went to school with, but man, it got exhausting. But like, no, I can't go skiing. I don't know how to ski. I can't afford skis, let alone a ski pass. And it's just not my top priority. And no, I'm not going to Europe. Love Europe. We'll go when I can afford it, but I can't afford it right now. It was just so important to have somebody to have this really welcoming environment. So Dwayne Clarence Mead is a huge reason why I'm here talking to you. He unfortunately didn't have a chance to complete his degree because he was sent home due to academic trouble, which was definitely nothing to do with his academic abilities, and had a lot to do with feeling so invisible on campus. He was a little older than your typical undergrad, and so I think the fact that it was inappropriate to have to walk that path was more apparent to him. It took me a couple of years to be like, no, this isn't just me. This is a problem. But he saw it earlier. And so I think it was harder earlier to walk that path. In any case, while he was attempting to go through the standard hoops of returning to campus, he was unfortunately shot and died and didn't get to return and finish his degree. So that is a large part of why I'm here saying, well, Dwayne doesn't get a chance to be NAHU president, but he made me believe that I belonged with NAC. And at a time when I was like, I don't know if I did, I did grow up on a res, I'm not sure it's right. And so he can't be here, so I am. It was really long. I promise to be shorter in the future.
An important story to share that, definitely shows our connection and how sometimes, our voices are a collection of our communities and experiences and lifting up those who can't be with us today. We've had some questions come in as well, and I know that earlier I had shared a piece by Susan Powers. The full short story called First Fruits is in an anthology collection of hers called Roof Walkers, but there's a selection, a snippet of that piece, which has this quote that says, "I was taught to believe that time is not a linear stream, but a hoop spinning forward like a wheel where everything is connected and everything is eternal. In this cosmology, I am here because Caleb came before me and he was here in anticipation of me. We are bounded together across time, and I will recognize him when I see him. Will he recognize me?" And I wanted to share that with you because in my opening as well, I read this piece as an undergraduate, reading a piece from a Harvard alumna who sort of conceived of this based on her undergraduate experience, a Native alumna. And when it resonated with a bit of that feeling of invisibility that Emily mentioned in her story and in her sharing. And I think it also resonated potentially with the invisibility of Harvard's Native history on campus. The invisibility of the fact that so many can graduate from Harvard and never know Caleb's story, never know that because of him, they are able to be at this institution. Because of the Indian students, Harvard was able to have the financial resources and stability to keep its doors open. And so I think that has been a large part of my call to advocacy in this space and calls to action. And I will note too, I love this opportunity to share this space with some of our other fellow Native alumni, Harvard Native alumni. And so I did err in my opening where I mentioned that our charter is the only charter that recognizes the education of Indigenous youth. We also have Dartmouth. And so but that binds us as well as Indigenous students in the Ivy League. There is something unique about Ivy League institutions and the way in which they were constructed and their ability to be a persistent force and institution in America I would argue, would not be but for the allowance of Indigenous nations for them to continue to exist at that early period in American history. And so in that, there is a relationality, there is a reciprocity that calls all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, into action and advocacy. Do you have thoughts, Megan? I know we've had some other questions come in too, so.
Yeah, and I can actually answer. Danielle had put forward a question about other steps that other institutions of higher ed have taken that Harvard could learn from. Something that I'm really reflective of, I'm currently a doctoral student at University of Minnesota, and I work at the University of South Dakota. And on both of our campuses, we actually have directors who are focused on tribal relations. That's their entire position. The University of Minnesota actually just hired a senior advisor to the president of the institution. Her name is Karen Diver. She is fabulous. She was actually advised, she worked for Obama at one point. Minnesota is tremendously lucky to have her. At USD, we have Damon Leadercharge, who is my dear friend, and has been tremendous also in developing those tribal relations and connections. And I think that often institutions don't understand how much their influence has spread across Indian country through generations of families. And I think that Harvard in so many ways thinks, we admit one Native student and that's good for that Native student, but for Native people, it reverberates throughout their entire community. Their entire community knows that their student is going to Harvard. They've been given an opportunity, and it paves and sets a different path for those families and those communities to be able to see that as possible for them. So I think that in sort of thinking about things that I've seen at other institutions, beyond just what Harvard is doing, really actually having somebody who's fully committed to Harvard's relationship to tribal communities. And there are fantastic classes on nation building that I mentioned. But something that I've seen to be very powerful in the Plains region is to actually have somebody who is connecting with tribal nations, whether state, federally, or non-recognized, and saying, how do we support your students? How do we have these conversations about the harms that our institutions have also caused? Which I think goes to Jackie's question of like, how do we go beyond land acknowledgments in ways that aren't extractive or harmful for Native people? And I think it's really on the ground being able to actually bring communities into conversation. So that was one sort of recommendation that I had and would have to Harvard if I'm given the opportunity to present it. And also want to pass it to Emily and Kelsey if they have any other recommendations for things that Harvard could do that are maybe different at other institutions as well.
Yeah, thank you so much to Jackie for that question as well. So for all the questions that have come in, both Danielle's and then Jackie's, but the combination I think is really important of thinking through how can these measures not be extractive or cause more harm, because we've already sort of indicated the level of different types of harm and trauma experienced by Native students at Harvard, and then more broadly by the Native community in its sort of interactions with Harvard. And so I think it's something that always has to be at the forefront of our considerations moving forward, and how we plan strategically for what does action and advocacy look like in these spaces. And so in thinking about my response to that, I really also want to heighten the level of labor that this requires and the level of work that this requires. You can't just, Harvard and Harvard, when we say that, there's a lot of layers and to Harvard and bureaucracy to Harvard. So it's going to have to happen across scales, across the different schools, with staff, with faculty, with students. It's not something that is just going to magically appear. Folks have to be committed to doing the work. And that's why I think it's great to start these conversations with alumni, because we also have a role in doing the work and in reconciling and remedying these past injustices, and also planning for a future that's more just and equitable. And in doing that, one of the areas that I wanted to highlight is, I think, the disproportionate burden that is placed on early career faculty and faculty at the institution, students at the institution, to indigenize or decolonize curriculum when they just want to be there to learn. They just want to be there to do their research like everybody else has the privilege to do. And so I think if we are trying to think about how do we decolonize curriculum, we also have to invest in the staff and resources who their main charge is to do that. Don't add it to someone else's plate out of a position of privilege where you can kind of toss it off. This isn't a game of hot potato. And I think historically, it's just been like, oh, well, you're a Native faculty member, you should indigenize all of the white faculty's curriculum. And that's not you doing the work. That's not you putting in the responsibility of your own reciprocity and relationality and call to action to commitment to the charge of the charter. So that would be a little bit of my response.
There was so much there, and it was so good. I agree that alumni, I've said this more than once, but I'm going to say it again in this forum because I don't think you've heard me. They can't excommunicate us or fire us as alumni. Like, a young faculty member has to walk a very delicate path, and students have so many roles. But we have a privileged position, according to very few people on earth, to be Harvard alumni. So we have this amazing mandate to push Harvard to be the best version of itself it can be, just like they were supposed to push us once upon a time. And certainly I'm still learning from Harvard, and I'm glad to see when they want to learn from me, but it's just not enough to hire a few Indigenous faculty members. And we are so grateful for those hires. We've been asking for many years, like many alumni have asked for decades, for the progress that we've made so far. But Kelsey's absolutely right. Like, a few Native faculty will not survive the number of committees, the number of additional tasks required. Like, they're doing fine. They're rock stars, but they're not going to stick around forever if it's all on their shoulders for decades to come, like it was for Dennis Norman, who was amazing and much more resilient than I would have been. But it needs to be a bigger community effort to say Harvard is an amazing place with a lot of learning, and they are genuinely behind when it comes to anything related to Indigenous studies or inclusion and belonging, true inclusion and belonging on campus. So it's not that they have to be, and it's not that we can't get there, but you need some money behind it. You need some true political will that survives people coming and going, so that we, the alumni, don't have to start at ground zero again and again. This is doable. You have to have alumni that continue to push. That's why we are. But you also you really need the administration to stop being afraid to change, and instead say, no, we're tired of losing these incredible Native students to Stanford and Dartmouth. And let's change our reputation in Indian country. Let's become the leaders that we can be.
Yeah, I think there's so much there. And we had a question come in about, you mentioned, Emily, resources. We had a question come in about whether or not there are sufficient Harvard scholarships, really any Harvard scholarships, for Native students to attend the institution. And Megan put in a great resource that has newly become available for Harvard Law School students. But I think we also need to be pushing more strategically for the institution to set up some type of scholarship that actually is done in recognition of the economic benefits that Harvard has received through the stolen lands of Indigenous peoples and off the stolen labor and in slavery of Indigenous and Black bodies in its history. So Georgetown has done something similar with the descendants of slaves that were held by Georgetown University. And so I think that Harvard will likely be moving in that direction in the future, both for those enslaved, the descendants of those who were enslaved by Harvard. And at that period in time, those were both Black and Indigenous peoples who were enslaved. And potentially others. I mean, there is a history in New England of indentured servitude that did not, that also included other populations. And I think Harvard has to reconcile and speak to those communities that it has historically oppressed and dispossessed and been violent towards. And a big way to speak to that is, you know, putting money forward. And that money, it's not like Harvard is gifting that to these communities or to these descendants. That money is only but for, the Harvard endowment is only but for that dispossession and violence that was geared towards these populations and communities. So it's about, you know, having these difficult conversations of how does Harvard repair these relationships, and in large part it is by putting more resources in place. It is by drawing down on the endowment to set up endowed scholarships for communities who have been dispossessed and violently harmed by the university and institution historically, and in many ways still are. We can talk about the land holdings that Harvard has, City of Cambridge, Harvard Forest. Those are Indigenous lands, and there really aren't receipts for when those lands were ever transferred.
There are a lot of really fabulous people in here who have worked with me in undergraduate admissions in different capacities. And I think that dissemination of knowledge, even just for Indigenous communities, is not there. My partner and I joke often that I don't even bring up Harvard in the state of South Dakota. It doesn't matter if you're not connected to community. I say I went to school on the East Coast. I feel like there are so many communities of color that use that sort of phrase of like, because it's not been a space that's been accessible. And I think that so many Native students even don't know that Harvard is a need-based institution. They're need blind. I mean, they could fully fund an Indigenous student if they are Pell eligible and are considering an institute. You know, they don't even have the concept working in higher education being focused on students. So many of our students don't even understand that Harvard could ever be a possibility for them in their wildest dreams. It's a sweatshirt school, right? It's a school that they see on movies. It's not a place that they actually can envision themselves. And so I think that even that accessibility of knowledge, part of the reason why I've chosen to run with the Harvard Forward platform, for those of you that are joining us that are new to sort of understanding this process, is this idea of actually being elected by the people, by people who are represented on the ground doing this work. And Harvard Forward has given myself and my two running mates, Yvette and Natalie, an opportunity to actually be on the ground and ask these questions of what is really important to you in your communities. We're not at the top of corporations. You know, we're people who are doing hard work that's on the ground, and we represent Harvard in the same way that all of you that are on this call that graduated from these institutions also represent your institutions and should feel empowered to feel like you have a voice to say something. And so in sort of having these conversations, I think so much of the reason that Emily and Kelsey and I are doing this work is because we don't want other Native students to go through the same harm that we felt that we experienced during our time at institutions like Harvard. That's a big part of the reason why I continue to work with students, is really in sort of evaluating my own experience as Native people. Native people are very generationally focused, right? We look backwards and we look forwards at what's ahead for our communities. And so I think that so many of these are connected to the work that all of us are doing across different platforms, but really just excited to see what the possibilities are that are ahead for Harvard, if Harvard is willing to have the conversation.
Can I, sorry, I'm coming from a completely different background, and I want to provide a little bit of insight that hopefully might be helpful. I graduated from the Graduate School of Design in 1993. I have been working in a totally different area. But being Asian and being a minority, I always had imposter syndrome when I got into the school. And I came from a generation that, in family that did not were not very supportive of women and minorities, Asian, doing what I'm doing. And I'd like to provide something that maybe might help you further your influence going forward, because I was crippled by a lot of stuff that I didn't understand about structural institutional racism, not just or institutional cultural just biases, even within my own family and my own culture. And this is not in any way to put any pressure on anything, just giving you some awareness that might perhaps help you in making more progress than I felt like I was able to achieve. So I am now, I'm adjunct faculty at USC School of Architecture. I'm interdisciplinary. One of the biggest challenge I found in progressing was not recognizing a lot of the biases within my own culture that kept me back, which also support, because I ended up I'm 53. I just paid off my Harvard student loans when I was 50. I'm very proud of the fact that I put myself through school. So a lot of these things I'm listening to, including from my own students, and I have a lot of students. I have like 158 in one class, and I've got a design studio, and I'm hearing them, and I'm hearing about the challenges that they're facing. And it doesn't matter what background we come from, the stereotypes that have prevented us from moving forward, we have to face ourselves. But some of it, like I faced, had to do with not having a support after I graduated and needing to find mentorship, and really, really real mentorship that could at least provide me with some insight with some of the challenges that I faced in what I was doing, whether it's law, architecture, history, academia. There just wasn't that kind of network. And the background that I had, you think that, the stereotypes of Asian are that we believe in education, but big problem, it isn't what it's a stereotype. And it isn't always, and some of the problems had to do with my understanding of, women's issues and stuff like that. So what I feel like is really important, especially if you go into, let's say, academia, publishing and perishing. The problems with publishing is there's publishing of a certain nature that is accepted. So I learned how to do a documentary. Now I'm traveling all over the country with my documentary, but that's how I had to learn how to publish in innovative ways, and getting the universities to acknowledge that publishing is changing as well. And then that's an important thing to acknowledge for getting tenure, for example. There are many new ways of publications because of the new platforms, but getting institutions to recognize that. And I've been advocating for this for years. I serve on the part-time faculty affairs committee at university, and I'm like this broken record, constantly speaking up. So I am defying some of my stereotypes constantly. But that's one thing. Other area like mentorship, and really, it's not just having a voice, it's being effective with the voice and being consistently persistent. And that's really some of the hardest lessons for young people to understand.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop
it is. Yeah. And I just wanted to jump in because unfortunately we're running out of time, and really appreciated, Mina, all of your thoughts, and hopefully we'll be able to continue the conversation at a later time. But just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody for coming and being a part of this. And just wanted to really thank Dr. Van Dyke and Dr. Leonard. Someday I will be a doctor and we can all be doctors together, and it will be beautiful. And I look forward to it. And I appreciate the two of you so much for everything that you do for this community. And I am just so grateful to be in conversation with Native alumni like you. Again, thank you so much for joining us, to everybody who is on the call. As I mentioned earlier, I am running for the Harvard Board of Overseers, along with two wonderful fellow Harvard Forward candidates, Natalie Untersell and Dr. Yvette Efifera, who both were on this call at different points in time, which was wonderful. Our election ends in 8 days. So if you are alumni, if you could please be sure to vote before May 18th, and to ask all of the Harvard alumni friends that you have to vote. We would really, really appreciate it. We believe that we bring a really strong and amazing platform to the front, and we really look forward to working with you. We just need to get into those seats. The voting is quick and easy online, but you do have to find a personalized code that Harvard emailed to you. So please don't leave it until the last minute. You can learn more about Harvard Forward and how to vote online at harvardforward.org/vote. And finally, we have another really awesome event this Wednesday featuring Dr. Efifera and 2 other alumni. We're going to talk about how we can shape institutions, including Harvard for the Better. And on Thursday evening, all 3 candidates will be on Twitter for a virtual Twitter town hall. For those of you that tweet, I think it's going to be really fun. So if you want to hang out online and ask questions, you're welcome to. And Danielle will put a link in the chat for where you can register for all of those events. And again, as we're coming up on the hour, just want to really thank Dr. Leonard and Dr. Van Dyke. Thank you so much for being in conversation with us. If there are any Native alumni that are on the call currently that are not tapped into NAHU, I really encourage you to reach out to Dr. Van Dyke or Dr. Leonard. I just got linked in to NAHU, and I've been an alum for like 4 years. So for other Native alumni that are on this call, if you're not linked into them, please do. And again, just want to say thank you so much to everybody for joining this call. Pilameye, we appreciate you being with us this evening.